A smile can hide a very sharp secret. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The snow had been falling for 3 days across the Gloucestershire countryside, transforming Ashworth Manor into something from a winter fairy tale, though Miss Jane Marple suspected that fairy tales, like real life, often contained more darkness than their pretty surfaces suggested. She adjusted her knitting in the comfortable chair by the library fire, watching the assembled guests through her wire-rimmed spectacles with the gentle, unassuming attention that had served her so well over the years. Lady Ashworth had invited her for the traditional 12th night celebration, and Miss Marple had accepted gratefully, knowing that such gatherings often revealed the most fascinating aspects of human nature. Sir Henry Ashworth moved among his guests with the practiced courtesy of a man born to entertain, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tension around his eyes when his gaze fell upon his son Oliver. The young man stood near the tall windows overlooking the snow-laden gardens, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour, his handsome features marred by an expression of barely concealed resentment. Oliver had returned from London under circumstances that the village had discussed with the particular relish reserved for the misfortunes of the wealthy, and his engagement to Miss Clara Pemberton had been announced with a haste that suggested practical considerations rather than romantic ones. Clara herself sat primly beside the fire, her pale hands folded in her lap, occasionally glancing toward Oliver with an expression that Miss Marple recognized as the look of a young woman trying very hard to convince herself that duty and affection were the same thing. Her companion, Miss Prynn, hovered nearby with the watchful air of a governess who had never quite relinquished her charge, her sharp eyes missing nothing of the social undercurrents that swirled through the elegant room like invisible fog. Dr. Morrison, the family physician, engaged Colonel Weatherby in discussion about the shocking state of the roads, while Mrs. Kellett, the postmistress, whispered confidentially to anyone who would listen about the strange hours being kept at the manor lately. The rector and his wife added their gentle presence to the gathering, though Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Clement's usually cheerful demeanor seemed somewhat strained, as if she had heard something in the confessional that troubled her Christian sensibilities. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple observed the small details that others overlooked. The way Oliver's hand trembled slightly when he reached for his glass, the nervous habit Clara had developed of touching the locket at her throat, the meaningful glances exchanged between Sir Henry and Dr. Morrison when they thought no one was watching. The fire crackled pleasantly, casting dancing shadows across the Persian carpet, but there was an undercurrent of tension that no amount of seasonal cheer could quite dispel. The conversation turned to plans for the evening's entertainment, a series of tableaux vivants that had been a tradition at Ashworth Manor for generations. Oliver was to play the part of a medieval knight, while Clara would portray a damsel in distress, an irony that was not lost on Miss Marple's observant eye. As the guests began to move toward the great hall where the performance was to take place, she noticed Oliver excuse himself, claiming he needed to fetch his costume from his room. 20 minutes later, when the makeshift stage had been arranged and the audience assembled, Oliver had not returned. Sir Henry sent a servant to fetch him, his irritation barely concealed beneath his polite exterior. The maid returned quickly, her face pale with shock, stammering that she could not rouse Master Oliver and that his door was locked from the inside. Dr. Morrison immediately took charge, leading a small group upstairs while the remaining guests waited in increasingly uncomfortable silence. When he returned, his professional composure had deserted him entirely. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible accident," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oliver is dead. It appears he fell and struck his head on the marble hearth in his room." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Clara's sharp intake of breath and the soft thud of Miss Prynn's smelling salts hitting the floor. Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her keen eyes swept the room, noting each person's reaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that in such moments, truth often revealed itself in the space between shock and composure. She had seen enough of life to know that accidents, particularly convenient ones, deserved the most careful scrutiny of all. The silence stretched like a taut wire until Sir Henry's voice cut through it, steady despite the tremor in his hands. "No one is to leave the house until the authorities arrive," he said, and Miss Marple noted how naturally he assumed command even in grief, the instincts of generations of landed gentry asserting themselves in crisis. Dr. Morrison cleared his throat and excused himself to attend to the formalities, while Colonel Weatherby took it upon himself to assist with the practical arrangements that death always demanded. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and drifted toward the staircase with the unassuming air of someone who simply wished to be helpful. The small party ascending to Oliver's room included Sir Henry, Dr. Morrison, and, surprisingly, Miss Prynn, who declared with crisp authority that she could not abandon Clara in such circumstances and therefore must see things for herself. The corridor carpet muffled their footsteps, and Miss Marple observed how the forced lock had splintered the old wood around the brass fittings. Inside, the key lay on the floor near the skirting board, as if it had fallen when the door gave way. Oliver's body remained as they had found him, crumpled beside the marble hearth, with one arm thrown awkwardly behind him. The dark stain on the carved corner of the mantelpiece told its grim story, while a whiskey glass rested on the side table, bearing the telltale smudge of fingers. Miss Marple's mild gaze took in the scene with the same gentle attention she might give to arranging flowers, noting the rucked Persian rug beneath Oliver's jacket and the curious fact that the fire had been laid but never lit, despite the open matchbox on the mantel. "Poor fellow slipped on that polished floor," Dr. Morrison pronounced with the firm tone of a man establishing facts. "The blow would have been instantaneous." Yet Miss Marple noticed how his eyes avoided Sir Henry's face when he spoke, and how his hands, usually so steady, betrayed the slightest tremor as he closed his medical bag. Constable Meadows arrived within the hour, his bicycle tracks cutting dark lines through the pristine snow. He was a practical man who preferred straightforward explanations, and after his examination, he pronounced the death a clear case of accident. "Tragic, but these things happen," he declared, making careful notes about the locked door, the whiskey, and the unfortunate combination of polished floors and marble hearths. As the official proceedings concluded and the guests retreated to the drawing room, the natural human tendency toward speculation began to assert itself. Mrs. Kellett, never one to let tragedy interfere with her inclination toward gossip, spoke in hushed tones about Oliver's recent troubles. "There was talk of gambling debts from London," she whispered, her eyes bright with the importance of possessing significant information. "Substantial ones, from what the postman heard, the kind that might drive a young man to desperate measures." Clara sat rigidly in her chair by the fire, her pale hands folded in her lap, occasionally touching the locket at her throat with an automatic gesture that seemed more habit than grief. She had shed no tears, though her face bore the stunned expression of someone whose carefully arranged future had suddenly crumbled. Miss Prynn hovered beside her with maternal concern, occasionally offering comfort that seemed to fall on deaf ears. He had been rather quiet since returning from London, Lady Ashworth confided to Miss Marple over tea, her usually immaculate appearance dishevelled by shock. Henry thought it was merely the adjustment of coming home, of settling into his engagement. We had hoped the marriage would steady him. Her voice carried the weight of parents who had watched their child struggle and believed love might provide salvation. Dr. Morrison reappeared to announce that death had been instantaneous, directing his professional assessment primarily to Lady Ashworth, but allowing his gaze to linger on Clara, as if measuring her reaction. "There would have been no suffering," he added, though something in his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as his listeners. As evening approached and the snow continued its relentless descent, effectively trapping the house party at Ashworth Manor, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by small inconsistencies that seemed to concern no one else. The position of Oliver's body suggested he had been moving away from the fireplace rather than toward it. His evening clothes had been laid out on the bed, as if he intended to change for dinner despite his earlier claims of fatigue. Most curious of all was the fact that the hearth brush in his room showed different wear patterns than those elsewhere in the house, suggesting it had been used by someone left-handed, while Oliver had always been notably right-handed. She kept these observations to herself, continuing her knitting with patient rhythm. Experience had taught her that in cases of sudden death, the truth often lay hidden beneath layers of assumption and convenience, waiting for someone with sufficient patience and understanding of human nature to uncover it. The locked door that had so impressed Constable Meadows might well prove to be the least mysterious aspect of Oliver Ashworth's untimely demise. The morning brought no relief from the snow, which continued its relentless descent, transforming Ashworth Manor into an island of enforced intimacy where grief and suspicion mingled like smoke in the winter air. Miss Marple descended to breakfast to find the household struggling with the peculiar atmosphere that accompanies sudden death, where normal conversation feels inappropriate, yet silence becomes unbearable. The smaller dining room had been chosen for its cozier dimensions, though nothing could warm the chill that seemed to emanate from the assembled company. Sir Henry maintained his composure with the practiced dignity of his class, ensuring his guests were attended to despite the hollow look in his eyes. Lady Ashworth appeared utterly shattered, her usual vivacity replaced by a fragile quietude that made everyone speak in hushed tones. Clara sat beside Miss Prynn, both women picking delicately at their breakfast, though Miss Marple noticed how Clara's fingers continued their nervous habit of touching the locket at her throat, a gesture that seemed more compulsive than comforting. Mrs. Kellett, fortified by the importance of being present during such dramatic circumstances, had positioned herself where she could monitor all conversations while appearing to help with the serving. "Such a tragedy," she murmured to Colonel Weatherby, her voice pitched to carry across the table. "Poor Oliver was always rather wild, wasn't he? London can be so dangerous for young men with more spirit than sense." Her words stirred the latent discomfort around the table, and Miss Marple observed how Dr. Morrison's hand paused momentarily over his teacup. After breakfast, Miss Marple encountered the upstairs maid, Nell, in the corridor carrying a coal scuttle. The girl seemed grateful for a kind word in the midst of the household's distress. "We had laid fires in all the rooms yesterday, miss," she explained, "including Mr. Oliver's. He always liked a warm hearth. Funny thing, though, his matches were out on the mantel as if he meant to light it, but the kindling was still laid crosswise just so. I cleaned up this morning with the brush from the nursery, because his proper one was missing. Mrs. Collins told me to use what was to hand, but it felt wrong somehow." Miss Marple's gentle gaze took in the girl's soot-stained left cuff, matching what she had observed on the small hearth brush in Oliver's room. "How thoughtful of you, dear," she murmured, filing away another small inconsistency in the official story. A right-handed man's fireplace, cleaned by a left-handed brush, suggested someone else had been in that room, someone who used their left hand naturally. Dr. Morrison appeared shortly after, looking tired but resolute as he discussed the necessary formalities with Sir Henry. "The certificate will read accidental death," he announced, though Miss Marple noticed he avoided looking directly at Clara when he spoke. The conversation that followed revealed more than perhaps intended about Oliver's financial difficulties, substantial gambling debts that had made his engagement to Clara both convenient and necessary. Later, as Miss Marple made her way past Oliver's sealed room, she paused to examine the splintered door frame where Constable Meadows had forced entry. The constable stood dutifully nearby, and when she mentioned possibly dropping Lady Ashworth's shawl pin, he obligingly moved aside to help her search. While appearing to look for the non-existent pin, Miss Marple observed a thin, dark mark on the floorboards and a minute smear of wax beneath the keyhole, suggesting someone had manipulated the lock from outside using the old trick of candle wax and string. In the drawing room, she found Clara gazing out at the falling snow with an expression of curious detachment. "Such a shock for you, my dear." Miss Marple said gently, settling nearby with her knitting. "Yes," Clara replied, her voice oddly flat. Oliver was always so full of life. Her fingers moved again to the locket, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted how the chain seemed newer than the pendant itself. "A family piece?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. Clara hesitated just long enough to be significant. "My grandmother's. Oliver had promised me a proper engagement gift after the new year." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Miss Marple had heard enough lies in St. Mary Mead to recognize the particular cadence of deception designed to protect a larger truth. As afternoon approached, Constable Meadows made his methodical rounds, taking statements and gathering what evidence the scene provided. It was then that he produced his most significant find, wrapped carefully in his handkerchief. A silver lighter bearing a lion rampant, the kind of restless man's accessory that showed the wear of constant handling. "Found it on the carpet outside Miss Pemberton's door," he announced solemnly. The reaction around the room was immediate and telling. Sir Henry's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if any development was preferable to uncertainty. Dr. Morrison's gaze flicked quickly to Miss Prynn, who had moved protectively behind Clara's chair. Most interesting of all, Miss Prynn's left hand, still bearing traces of soot, disappeared behind her back as if to hide evidence of something she preferred not to explain. Miss Marple continued her knitting with steady rhythm, but her mind was already weaving together the threads of deception that seemed to surround Oliver Ashworth's convenient death. The locked door, the unlit fire, the left-handed cleaning, and now the lighter found in such a significant location all suggested that this tragedy was far more complex than a simple accident, and that someone in this snowbound house possessed secrets worth killing to protect. The silver lighter lay upon the mantelpiece like an accusation, its engraved lion rampant, catching the firelight with each flicker of the flames. Constable Meadows regarded it with the satisfaction of a man who had found something concrete to anchor his investigation, while the assembled company studied the object with varying degrees of discomfort. The crest was unmistakably that of the Ashworth family, and the lighter bore the telltale patina of frequent use, though Clara's pale face registered what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. "I've never seen it before in my life," she said quietly, her voice carrying the hollow ring of truth mixed with growing fear. "Oliver didn't smoke, and he certainly never carried such a thing." Her fingers moved instinctively to her locket again, the nervous gesture now seeming less like grief and more like a desperate attempt to anchor herself to something familiar in a world that was rapidly spinning beyond her control. Miss Prynn stepped forward immediately, her protective instincts flaring like a mother hen defending her chick. Miss Pemberton was in shock yesterday evening and retired immediately to her room with chamomile tea. I remained with her until well past midnight to ensure she was properly settled. Her voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations, though Miss Marple noticed how her left hand remained carefully positioned behind her back, still bearing those telltale traces of soot. Colonel Weatherby cleared his throat and approached Miss Marple with the respectful gravity that soldiers sometimes accorded to observant older women. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "if you'll forgive me speaking plainly, this business reminds me of something that happened in India years ago. A young subaltern found dead in his quarters, door bolted from inside. Put down to eat and drink, but something felt wrong about the whole affair, never could say precisely what." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently as she considered his words. "You had the sense of a pattern disturbed, Colonel. People rarely break their established habits without compelling reason. When a young man who habitually lights his fire leaves it laid but cold, and when someone who guards his possessions carefully drops a valuable item in an unexpected place, one feels there has been a small rearrangement of the natural order." Constable Meadows began taking formal statements with methodical precision, clearly pleased to have something substantial to investigate. Miss Prynn stood like a sentinel during Clara's questioning, her back straight and her manner uncompromising. "I did not permit Clara to be alone with Oliver yesterday afternoon," she stated firmly. "There had been strain between them since the engagement was announced, and I judged it best that they proceed with proper supervision." "What manner of strain?" Meadows inquired, seizing upon anything that might suggest motive. "The kind that accompanies arrangements made for practical rather than romantic considerations," Miss Prynn replied with pointed discretion. "We all hoped that affection might follow in time, but such things cannot be forced." When questioned about her movements during the crucial period, Miss Prynn provided a detailed account of mending Clara's torn hem in the green sitting room, with Mrs. Collins confirming the delivery of tea at 3:15. Clara herself admitted only to fetching her shawl from her room, a simple statement delivered with just enough stiffness to catch Miss Marple's attention. The questioning revealed a wealth of small observations that had gone unremarked in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy. Nell, the upstairs maid, proved particularly helpful when summoned to give her account. "I was sent up twice yesterday evening," she explained nervously. "Once to bank the fires properly, and again to deliver hot water bottles to the ladies' rooms. When I went to Miss Pemberton's chamber, there was such a strong smell of lavender water, much stronger than usual, and the carpet outside her door was damp, as if someone had spilled something and cleaned it hastily." Miss Prynn's composure flickered for just an instant before she recovered smoothly. "I always use lavender water to calm Clara's nerves during times of distress. As for the carpet, I fear I was clumsy with the water pitcher in my concern for my charge's welfare." Mrs. Kellett, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic revelation, added her own observations about the unusual activity in the corridors well past the normal hour. "There were footsteps above my room until nearly midnight," she declared with importance. "I thought it was merely the servants attending to the necessary arrangements, but now one wonders." As the afternoon progressed and testimonies were recorded, a consensus began to emerge that satisfied Constable Meadows' desire for a tidy conclusion. The lighter, found in such a significant location, combined with the acknowledged strain between the engaged couple and Oliver's known financial difficulties, painted a picture that required no further investigation. A lover's quarrel, perhaps escalated beyond intention, Meadows confided to Sir Henry, with the relief of a man who had found an explanation that would spare everyone involved from more painful scrutiny. Miss Marple excused herself for a gentle walk to ease her stiff joints, a request that no one found unusual. She paused at the spot where the lighter had been discovered, studying the unremarkable square of carpet with the same mild attention she might give to a particularly interesting stitch pattern. There, barely visible on the skirting board, was the faintest scuff mark, as if something taut had grazed it at speed before being hastily removed. Combined with the waxy residue she had observed near Oliver's keyhole and the evidence of left-handed cleaning in his room, the mark suggested a level of preparation that accidents simply did not require. On her return journey, she encountered Dr. Morrison standing at the landing window, staring out at the relentless snow as if seeking absolution in its pristine whiteness. "A difficult business, Doctor," she observed gently. He started slightly, then managed a tight smile. "Indeed, Miss Marple, death in a house always leaves an unpleasant atmosphere. One hopes the family can find peace." Oliver had been troubled of late, she ventured, as if seeking general information rather than specific details. "Troubled, yes." Dr. Morrison turned the word over carefully. "Financial obligations can weigh heavily on a young man. Sometimes help is offered, but it rarely comes without conditions attached." That evening, as candles were lit early against the gathering gloom, the household moved with the subdued quiet that accompanies the resolution of crisis. Constable Meadows announced his intention to recommend closure of the case, citing accidental death with possible contributing factors of emotional distress. The murmur of relief that greeted this decision was almost palpable, a collective exhalation from people eager to return to the comfortable certainties of their ordinary lives. Only Miss Marple remained unconvinced, her knitting needles working steadily as she observed the subtle dynamics that continued to play out around her. Clara's persistent nervousness, Miss Prynn's protective vigilance, and the general eagerness to accept a convenient explanation all suggested that Oliver Ashworth's death was merely the visible surface of much deeper and more dangerous currents. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the most obvious suspect was rarely the guilty party, and that comfort was often the very thing that killers relied upon to escape justice. The evening settled over Ashworth Manor with the deceptive peace that follows crisis, though Miss Marple recognized it as merely the calm that precedes a more thorough reckoning. Constable Meadows had departed with visible satisfaction, his report complete and his conclusions tidy, leaving behind a household eager to embrace the comfort of official resolution. Yet she observed how this relief manifested differently in each person. Sir Henry's shoulders had lost their rigid tension. Lady Ashworth moved with less of the brittle fragility that had marked her since the tragedy, and Clara seemed almost serene as she sat by the fire, her fingers no longer compulsively seeking her locket. Miss Marple excused herself after dinner to retrieve a forgotten handkerchief, a small errand that provided opportunity for the kind of gentle exploration that had served her so well over the years. Passing Sir Henry's study, she paused at the sound of voices within, the door standing slightly ajar in the manner of men who believe their privacy secure. "You told him plainly that assistance would be forthcoming if he honored his engagement and settled," Dr. Morrison was saying, his voice carrying the weight of shared responsibility. Sir Henry's reply came rougher than his usual measured tones. "I told him more than plainly, Morrison. The codicil stands clear. If he threw over Clara, he forfeited the trust and brought ruin to us all." There was a pause, the creak of leather as someone shifted position. "You advised it." The doctor's response held a peculiar gravity. "I advised what might keep him alive, Henry. Financial desperation makes men dangerous, particularly to themselves." This revelation cast new illumination on the tragedy, suggesting that Oliver's engagement to Clara had been less romantic arrangement than financial necessity. Miss Marple continued her quiet progress through the house, filing away this intelligence while her observant gaze sought the physical evidence that might support or contradict the emerging pattern of motive and opportunity. In the library, she discovered that the fireplace had been used recently, though not for warmth. Poking gently among the ashes with her knitting needle, she retrieved a fragment of paper that had resisted complete destruction. The edges were charred, but several words remained visible in a feminine hand that pressed too hard upon the page. "Warning. Expose, if cast off." Below these ominous phrases, a scrawl that might have been the initials CP caught her attention, along with a smear that suggested the hasty burning of correspondence. Later, when Clara approached to thank her again for mending the locket chain, Miss Marple seized the opportunity for closer examination. "Such a lovely piece," she murmured, studying the pendant with genuine appreciation. "Might I see the photograph again? I do so enjoy family portraits." Clara hesitated just long enough to be significant before opening the locket with reluctant fingers. The image within was not the expected family member, but rather a young man in military uniform, his shoulder bearing the partial insignia of a regiment Miss Marple did not recognize. In the margin, barely visible, was the penciled letter R, cut in half by the photograph's trimming. These discoveries began to weave themselves into a pattern that suggested careful planning rather than tragic accident. Miss Marple's subsequent exploration of the corridor where the lighter had been found yielded even more intriguing evidence. The loose skirting board she had noticed earlier concealed a coil of black silk thread, fine as a hair, along with traces of candle wax that carried the faint scent of lavender. Behind a nearby console, she discovered the missing nursery hearth brush, its bristles splayed and handle bearing the telltale smudges of left-handed use. The technical aspects of the crime began to clarify in her mind. The string and wax method was an old trick, one that allowed a key to be manipulated from outside a locked door through patient application of physics and human ingenuity. It required someone familiar with the technique, possessed of steady nerves, and, crucially, someone whose natural left-handedness would leave the particular traces she had observed. As she returned to the drawing room, Miss Marple reflected on how the various elements were beginning to align. Oliver's desperate financial situation, revealed through the overheard conversation, provided clear motive for multiple parties. The burnt letter suggested blackmail or coercion involving Clara, while the photograph in her locket hinted at emotional attachments that complicated the official narrative of their engagement. Most significantly, the physical evidence of the door manipulation, combined with the left-handed cleaning of Oliver's fireplace, pointed toward a killer who possessed both technical knowledge and intimate familiarity with the house's layout. Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway as she settled into her chair, his face bearing the expression of a man wrestling with conscience. When Clara joined them moments later, requesting private conversation with the doctor, Miss Marple observed the look that passed between them. Not the interaction of patient and physician, but rather the complex understanding of conspirators who had acted together toward a common, dangerous goal. The snow continued its relentless descent outside, and Miss Marple reflected that nature had provided the perfect isolation for secrets to unfold and justice to be quietly, methodically pursued. The morning brought a subtle shift in the household's atmosphere, as if the night had allowed certain truths to settle like sediment in still water. Miss Marple observed how people moved differently when they believed their secrets were secure, and how they betrayed themselves when those same secrets began to feel precarious. The snow continued its relentless descent, but within the warm confines of Ashworth Manor, a different kind of cold had taken hold. She found Clara in the morning room, ostensibly reading but clearly lost in troubled thoughts. The young woman's composure, which had held so remarkably through the official proceedings, now showed hairline cracks that spoke of internal pressure reaching dangerous levels. When Miss Marple settled nearby with her knitting, Clara seemed almost grateful for the company, though her fingers continued their nervous habit of touching the locket at her throat. "Such beautiful workmanship," Miss Marple observed gently, indicating the pendant. "Family pieces often carry the most interesting stories." Clara's response came hesitant and fractured, as if she were testing the waters of confession. The photograph within, she admitted, was not of a deceased grandmother, but of someone very much alive. Someone whose absence from her life had created the very vulnerability that Oliver had discovered and exploited. Miss Prynn appeared in the doorway with her characteristic efficiency, carrying a tray of correspondence that required Clara's attention. Miss Marple noted how the woman balanced the weight predominantly with her left hand, a small detail that connected to the nursery hearth brush and the particular wear patterns she had observed in Oliver's room. When Miss Prynn set down Clara's teacup, she did so with the same left-handed precision, though her movements carried an underlying tension that suggested awareness of scrutiny. Later, while exploring the library under the pretext of seeking reading material, Miss Marple discovered additional evidence of the careful planning that had preceded Oliver's death. Behind a volume of poetry, she found a small silver seal bearing the device of lavender sprigs, its surface bearing traces of the same wax she had observed beneath Oliver's keyhole. The seal's positioning suggested hasty concealment rather than casual misplacement, and its delicate craftsmanship spoke of personal significance to its owner. Dr. Morrison's behavior had grown increasingly erratic since Constable Meadows' departure. When Miss Marple encountered him in the conservatory, ostensibly tending to Lady Ashworth's prized orchids, his usual professional composure had given way to something approaching desperation. His conversation revealed fragments of a larger picture. Oliver's increasing demands for financial assistance, the codicil that tied his inheritance to his marriage, and the growing pressure from creditors whose patience had reached its limits. The boy was caught between impossible choices, he confided, his voice barely above a whisper. his father's conditions, his own debts, and certain other obligations that had become pressing. The doctor's careful phrasing suggested knowledge of additional complications, though he seemed reluctant to elaborate without direct questioning. The afternoon brought an unexpected development in the form of delayed correspondence, finally delivered despite the treacherous roads. Mrs. Kellett arrived with a packet of letters that had accumulated at the post office, including several bearing London postmarks and one with military insignia that caused Clara to pale visibly when she glimpsed it among the others. Miss Prynn immediately took charge of the correspondence, sorting it with the protective efficiency of someone accustomed to managing potentially dangerous information. Miss Marple observed this exchange with particular interest, noting how Miss Prynn's left hand trembled slightly as she handled the military letter, and how Clara's relief was palpable when it disappeared into her companion's reticule rather than being delivered directly. The interaction suggested a level of collaboration that extended beyond mere employer and employee, pointing towards shared secrets and mutual dependency. As evening approached, the household gathered for what everyone hoped would be their final night of enforced togetherness. The conversation turned inevitably to plans for departure once the roads cleared, but Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of anxiety among certain parties that suggested their desire to leave stemmed from more than mere inconvenience. Dr. Morrison excused himself early, claiming the need to check on patients in the village, though the continuing snowfall made such visits unlikely. Miss Prynn supervised Clara's early retirement with unusual solicitousness, insisting on personally preparing her evening tisane and remaining in her room well past the normal hour. These behaviors, innocent enough individually, formed a pattern that spoke of coordination and shared purpose. Miss Marple retired to her own room with much to consider. The physical evidence of the door manipulation, the left-handed cleaning of Oliver's fireplace, the lavender-scented wax, and the hastily concealed seal all pointed toward a carefully orchestrated crime rather than a tragic accident. More significantly, the emotional dynamics she'd observed suggested that Oliver's death had solved multiple problems for multiple people, creating a web of complicity that extended far beyond a simple case of murder for financial gain. The snow continued to fall outside her window, and Miss Marple reflected that nature had provided the perfect isolation for both crime and detection. In her long experience, she had learned that the most dangerous criminals were often those who believed themselves to be acting from noble motives, and that the most complex cases were those where victim and perpetrator had become so entangled that justice required the most delicate unraveling of cause and effect. The morning after the household's troubled night brought an atmosphere of barely suppressed tension that Miss Marple recognized as the particular stillness that precedes a storm. She descended to find Sir Henry in his study, his usual composure fractured by something beyond mere grief. The discovery that had shattered his careful control lay spread across his desk. Oliver's private papers, which he had finally brought himself to examine, revealed a correspondence that cast his son's recent behavior in an entirely new and disturbing light. Among Oliver's effects, Sir Henry had found a series of letters that spoke of debts far more substantial than anyone had imagined, but more troubling still were the carbon copies of correspondence that suggested Oliver had been engaged in activities that bordered on extortion. The implications were staggering, not merely for the family's reputation, but for several people currently residing under their roof. Oliver had been systematically collecting information about the private lives of those around him, information that could destroy reputations and ruin lives if made public. Miss Marple observed Sir Henry's distress with the gentle sympathy of someone who understood that parents often discovered their children's true natures only after death had made such knowledge unbearably painful. More significantly, she noted how his revelation affected the other members of the household when he shared it over breakfast. Clara's face went ashen, while Miss Prynn's protective instincts flared with an intensity that seemed almost violent. Dr. Morrison's reaction was perhaps the most telling, his professional composure cracking to reveal something approaching panic before he recovered himself. The morning brought another unsettling discovery when Mrs. Collins reported that several items had gone missing from Oliver's room during the night. Despite Constable Meadows' official sealing of the chamber, someone had gained entry and removed specific papers from Oliver's desk. The lock showed no signs of forcing, suggesting either a duplicate key or the same technical skill that had been employed in the original crime. Most disturbing was the selective nature of the theft. Whoever had entered had known exactly what they were seeking and where to find it. Miss Marple requested permission to examine Oliver's room once more, ostensibly to help organize his books for the family. Her methodical search revealed evidence of the nocturnal visitor, minute traces of lavender water on the carpet, the same scent that had become Miss Prynn's signature, and more significantly, several strands of black silk thread caught on the window latch. The thread was identical to what she had found behind the skirting board, confirming her suspicion that the same person who had manipulated Oliver's door had returned to eliminate evidence of their connection to him. In Oliver's writing desk, she discovered a hidden compartment that had been recently forced open, its delicate mechanism damaged by someone unfamiliar with its operation. Within the compartment lay a single photograph, apparently overlooked in the hasty search. The image showed a young woman in riding dress, her face partially obscured by shadow, but her posture and the setting unmistakably familiar. On the reverse, in Oliver's handwriting, were the words "insurance policy" and a date from the previous summer. The photograph's discovery coincided with Clara's increasingly erratic behavior throughout the day. Miss Prynn's vigilant supervision had intensified to the point where Clara seemed more prisoner than protected charge, never left alone and constantly monitored with an anxiety that suggested imminent danger rather than mere concern for her emotional state. When Miss Marple attempted gentle conversation with Clara about her plans for the future, Miss Prynn immediately intervened, citing her charge's fragile condition and need for complete rest. Dr. Morrison's visits to check on Clara's health became more frequent as the day progressed, each consultation followed by hushed conferences with Miss Prynn that carried the undertones of conspiracy rather than medical care. His manner had grown increasingly agitated, and Miss Marple observed how his hands trembled when he thought himself unobserved, the tremor of a man under extreme psychological pressure. As evening approached, the household gathered for what everyone hoped would be their final dinner together before the roads cleared sufficiently for departure. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by meaningful silences and careful avoidance of certain topics. Miss Marple noted how the various parties seemed to be waiting for something, their attention focused not on the present company, but on some anticipated event that would either resolve their difficulties or precipitate a crisis. The discovery of Oliver's extortion activities had transformed the nature of the crime from simple murder to something far more complex. Multiple people had possessed both motive and opportunity to kill him, but the selective theft of evidence suggested that someone was still actively working to conceal their involvement. The photograph in Miss Marple's possession represented a thread that, when pulled, might unravel the entire carefully constructed deception that surrounded Oliver Ashworth's convenient death. Most significantly, she had begun to understand that the crime extended beyond Oliver's murder to encompass a broader pattern of manipulation and control that had infected the entire household. The killer had not acted from simple desperation, but from a more complex mixture of protection, revenge, and the desperate desire to preserve secrets that were worth more than life itself. The evening brought an unsettling incident that crystallized Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the true nature of events at Ashworth Manor. She had positioned herself in the library with her knitting, ostensibly absorbed in a particularly intricate pattern, when she observed Miss Prynn making her way upstairs with Clara's evening tisane. The woman's movements carried an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the simple task of delivering chamomile tea, and Miss Marple noted how she paused outside Clara's door, as if steeling herself for something more significant than mere nursing care. 20 minutes later, Clara's distressed voice echoed through the corridor, followed by the sound of breaking crockery. When the household assembled in response to the commotion, they found Clara seated on her bed, pale and trembling, while Miss Prynn knelt beside an overturned teacup whose contents had spread across the Persian carpet in a pale aromatic pool. The explanation offered was simple enough. Clara had suffered a dizzy spell and knocked over her tea, but Miss Marple observed details that suggested a more complex reality. The spilled liquid carried the distinctive scent of lavender that had become Miss Prynn's signature, but beneath it lay an underlying bitterness that spoke of additional ingredients. More significantly, Miss Marple noted how Miss Prynn's left hand trembled as she gathered the broken pieces, and how her eyes avoided Clara's face during the subsequent explanations. Dr. Morrison's arrival seemed almost too prompt, as if he had been anticipating such a summons, and his examination of Clara carried the practiced efficiency of someone familiar with her particular vulnerabilities. While the household focused on Clara's apparent distress, Miss Marple quietly examined the scene with the gentle thoroughness that had served her so well over the years. Among the scattered papers from Miss Prynn's reticule, which had fallen during the confusion, she glimpsed fragments that told a more complete story. Correspondence bearing military postmarks, a document with official seals, and most intriguingly, a small silver seal bearing the device of lavender sprigs, its surface showing traces of the same wax she had observed beneath Oliver's keyhole. The following morning, as the household prepared for potential departure should the roads clear, Miss Marple found Miss Prynn in the morning room, methodically polishing silver with the precise movements that had become her hallmark. Settling nearby with her knitting, Miss Marple began the delicate psychological game that experience had taught her was often more effective than direct confrontation. "Such lovely craftsmanship," she observed, indicating the silver pieces. "It reminds me of a charming little seal I once admired, quite old-fashioned, with lavender sprigs engraved upon it, the kind used for sealing letters with wax, though I suppose such things are rather outdated in our modern times." She paused, allowing her mild gaze to rest on Miss Prynn's face. "The scent of lavender is so distinctive, isn't it? It has a way of lingering in the most unexpected places." Miss Prynn's polishing motion faltered almost imperceptibly, her knuckles whitening around the cloth. "Indeed, Miss Marple," she replied, her voice carrying a slight tension that had not been present moments before. "Lavender has always been associated with cleanliness and order." Miss Marple continued her gentle probing, her tone remaining conversational and innocent. "My nephew once told me about the most ingenious methods people have devised for opening locks without keys. Quite fascinating, really, involving wax and string and a great deal of patience. One would need steady hands, of course, and perhaps something to press the wax against. Such techniques require considerable skill and familiarity with mechanisms." The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Miss Prynn's left hand trembled slightly as she set down the silver, and her eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, held a flash of something between wariness and defiance. "I'm afraid such matters are quite beyond my experience, Miss Marple," she said with careful precision. "My concerns are entirely domestic in nature." Miss Marple smiled with gentle understanding, but her observant gaze had caught the telltale signs of recognition and fear. The mention of the wax technique, combined with the evidence of the lavender seal and the left-handed traces throughout the house, had struck precisely the nerve she had intended. Miss Prynn's denial had been too quick, too carefully constructed, revealing the very knowledge she sought to conceal. As the morning progressed, Miss Marple reflected on how the various threads of evidence were weaving themselves into a coherent pattern. The physical evidence of door manipulation, the emotional dynamics of protection and blackmail, and the careful coordination between Miss Prynn and Dr. Morrison all pointed toward a conspiracy far more complex than simple murder for financial gain. Oliver's death had been merely the first move in a larger game designed to protect secrets that multiple people were willing to kill for. The psychological pressure she had applied to Miss Prynn would now work like a slow poison, creating the anxiety and desperation that often led criminals to make the crucial mistakes that exposed their guilt. Miss Marple understood that patience was her greatest weapon, and that the truth, like cream, had a natural tendency to rise to the surface when given sufficient time and gentle encouragement. The psychological pressure Miss Marple had carefully applied throughout the day reached its crescendo as evening shadows lengthened across Ashworth Manor. Miss Prynn's composure, which had held with admirable tenacity through the official proceedings, now showed unmistakable signs of fracture. She moved through the house with restless energy, her left hand betraying a persistent tremor that she attempted to conceal through constant activity. Most tellingly, she had begun to avoid Miss Marple's gentle gaze entirely, a reaction that spoke volumes to someone experienced in reading the subtle language of guilt and fear. The breaking point came when Clara, seeking comfort in what she believed to be private conversation, confessed to Miss Marple the truth that had made her so vulnerable to Oliver's machinations. "I was not entirely honest about my circumstances," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "The photograph in my locket is of Lieutenant Robert Rawlins. We were married quietly in July, before my engagement to Oliver was arranged. Oliver discovered our correspondence and threatened to expose everything unless I submitted completely to his demands. This revelation cast Oliver's death in an entirely new light, transforming it from a simple case of financial desperation to something far more complex and dangerous. Miss Marple understood immediately that Clara's secret marriage represented not merely social scandal, but complete financial ruin for a young woman whose security depended entirely upon the Ashworth family's continued support. Oliver had possessed the power to destroy not only Clara's reputation, but her very survival, creating a motive for murder that extended far beyond the obvious suspect. Miss Marple decided to conduct a final, decisive test of her growing suspicions. That evening, she arranged Oliver's remaining papers in a deliberate pattern within a japanned tin, which she placed prominently on her writing table. Among the documents, she positioned the photograph she had discovered in Oliver's hidden compartment, along with several other items that would prove irresistible to someone desperate to eliminate incriminating evidence. Then she settled into her chair with apparent absorption in her knitting, while maintaining careful watch through lowered lashes. The response came sooner than expected. Near midnight, her door latch turned with the practiced silence of someone familiar with the house's particular mechanisms. Miss Prynn entered with the fluid grace of someone who had navigated these corridors in darkness before, her left hand guiding her progress, while her right carried the distinctive tools of her trade, a thin-bladed paper knife and a coil of black silk thread that caught the ember's glow like a spider's web. Miss Prynn approached the writing table with methodical efficiency, her movements betraying the same left-handed precision that had left its telltale traces throughout Oliver's room. When she discovered the photograph among the papers, her sharp intake of breath confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions about its significance. The image showed not Clara, as might have been expected, but Miss Prynn herself in younger years, captured in a moment of unguarded happiness that spoke of secrets worth killing to protect. One's own likeness can be quite revealing in unexpected circumstances, Miss Marple observed gently, not moving from her chair. Miss Prynn's reaction was immediate but controlled, her years of managing difficult situations asserting themselves even in this moment of exposure. "Some relics cause unnecessary pain when left in careless hands," Miss Prynn replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. She folded the paper knife with practiced precision and secured the photograph in her reticule, her movements betraying no hint of panic despite the gravity of her situation. The confrontation that followed revealed the careful architecture of deception that Miss Prynn had constructed. Around Oliver's death, Her confession came in measured phrases, each admission calculated to protect Clara while acknowledging her own culpability. She had indeed used the old string and wax technique to manipulate Oliver's door lock, creating the illusion of a room secured from within. The lavender-scented wax had come from her personal seal, pressed into service for a purpose far removed from its intended use of sealing innocent correspondence. Most significantly, Miss Prynn revealed the systematic nature of her protective campaign. She had been gradually poisoning Clara's evening tisanes with small doses of laudanum, creating a pattern of confusion and dizzy spells that would support a defense of diminished responsibility should Clara ever face formal accusations. Dr. Morrison's complicity extended beyond merely providing a convenient medical verdict. He had supplied both the sedatives and the technical knowledge necessary to ensure Oliver's death appeared accidental. As dawn approached and Miss Prynn concluded her careful confession, Miss Marple understood that she was dealing with a killer whose motives were rooted in a twisted form of maternal devotion. The woman had convinced herself that murder was justified to protect Clara from social destruction, but her actions had created a web of deception that threatened to destroy the very person she sought to save. The psychological manipulation, the systematic drugging, and the careful framing of evidence revealed a mind capable of extraordinary calculation in service of what she perceived as noble ends. The morning light filtering through the windows illuminated a transformed household where the comfortable certainties of the previous days had given way to the stark reality of premeditated murder, disguised as tragic accident. Miss Marple continued her knitting with steady rhythm, understanding that the most dangerous moment was yet to come, when the full scope of the conspiracy would be revealed and justice would finally be served. The morning brought crystalline light that transformed the snow-covered grounds of Ashworth Manor into something ethereal. Yet Miss Marple understood that clarity of a different sort was required within these walls. She had requested that the household gather in the drawing-room before any attempted departure, and her gentle but firm tone had brooked no argument. Even Sir Henry, who had clung desperately to the comfort of official closure, recognized that the time for comfortable deceptions had passed. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire, her knitting laid carefully aside, her hands folded with the quiet authority of someone who had reached the end of a long and complex journey. The assembled company watched her with varying degrees of apprehension, each person carrying the weight of secrets they hoped would remain buried beneath the official verdict of accidental death. I have spent considerable time these past days observing the small details that others might overlook, Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the gentle cadence that had disarmed so many over the years. A hearth brush used by someone left-handed in the room of a notably right-handed young man. Lavender-scented wax beneath a keyhole, pressed there with the deliberate care of someone familiar with old techniques for manipulating locks. A coil of black silk thread, fine as a hair, discovered where a skirting board had been carefully loosened. She paused, allowing her mild gaze to rest briefly on each person present. Dr. Morrison's hands trembled almost imperceptibly, while Miss Prynn maintained her rigid composure with visible effort. Clara sat pale and still, her fingers no longer seeking the comfort of her locket. These details, taken individually, might be dismissed as coincidence, Miss Marple continued. But together they paint a picture of careful preparation and deliberate deception. Someone had planned to make Oliver's death appear as a tragic accident, someone with both the technical knowledge and the steady nerves required for such an undertaking. Miss Marple's voice grew slightly firmer as she began to untangle the web of deception that had surrounded Oliver's death. Oliver Ashworth had become what one might call a collector of human weaknesses. He possessed what he termed insurance policies against several members of this household. Miss Pemberton's secret marriage to Lieutenant Rawlins provided him with leverage over her compliance. Miss Prynn's own past, captured in a photograph he had labelled with chilling calculation, gave him power over her devoted service to Clara. Dr. Morrison's face had grown ashen, but Miss Marple's attention turned to him with compassionate understanding rather than accusation. And you, Doctor, were perhaps the most vulnerable of all. Oliver had discovered the truth that you and Miss Prynn had worked so carefully to conceal, that Clara is not merely your patient, but your daughter, and Miss Prynn her mother. In a small community where reputation means survival, such knowledge represented complete destruction. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Clara's sharp intake of breath as understanding dawned. Miss Prynn's composure finally cracked, her left hand moving instinctively toward Clara in a gesture of protection that had become second nature over the years. On the afternoon of his death, Oliver summoned you to his room, Dr. Morrison, Miss Marple continued with gentle inexorability. He claimed illness, but his true purpose was extortion. He demanded immediate payment of substantial sums, threatening to expose not only Clara's marriage, but the true nature of your family relationship. When you refused, he spoke of Clara with deliberate cruelty, describing how he would enjoy watching her social destruction. Dr. Morrison's professional composure had completely deserted him, his shoulders sagging under the weight of confession. He laughed. The doctor whispered, his voice barely audible. He said he would make her suffer slowly, that her ruin would be his entertainment. I struck him then, not meaning to kill, but to silence that terrible laughter. He fell against the marble hearth, and I knew immediately that he was dead. Miss Marple nodded with sad understanding. In your panic, you sent for Miss Prynn, knowing that her devotion to Clara would compel her assistance. Together, you constructed the scenario that would protect your family from scandal. Miss Prynn used her knowledge of old techniques to manipulate the door lock from outside, creating the illusion of a room secured from within. The lavender-scented wax came from her personal seal, pressed into service for this desperate purpose. Miss Prynn's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the dignity of someone who had acted from love rather than malice. I would have taken all the blame, she said quietly. Clara's safety was worth any sacrifice, even my life. But you could not have committed the murder itself, Miss Marple explained gently. You were observed mending Clara's hem in the green sitting room when Mrs. Collins brought tea at 3:15. Several people noted your presence there for an extended period. The timing simply does not allow for you to have killed Oliver and returned unnoticed. The arrival of Constable Meadows brought the inevitable machinery of justice into motion, though Miss Marple had already sent word that new evidence required a reopening of the case. Dr. Morrison offered no resistance, asking only that Clara be spared the worst details of the proceedings. Miss Prynn, when informed that she must answer for her role as accessory after the fact, accepted the news with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the ordeal. Sir Henry, who had listened with the rigid attention of a man watching his world reshape itself, surprised everyone with his response. Miss Pemberton, Clara will not be turned out, he declared firmly. Whatever provisions were made to compel obedience will be altered. She shall be provided for, and if her husband proves worthy, he will be welcomed. If not, she shall remain under our protection regardless. As the official proceedings concluded and arrangements were made for departure, Miss Marple reflected on the complex arithmetic of human emotion that had led to this tragedy. Oliver Ashworth had died as a direct result of his own cruelty, victim of a father's protective rage and a conspiracy born from desperate love. The three people responsible had acted not from simple malice, but from the kind of devotion that, while admirable in its intentions, had led them down a path that justice could not ignore. The snow continued to fall outside the windows of Ashworth Manor, covering the estate in pristine whiteness that seemed to promise redemption and new beginnings. Yet Miss Marple understood that some stains could not be so easily covered, and that the consequences of this winter's tragedy would echo through the lives of those involved for years to come. As she prepared for her own departure, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the same careful attention she had given to unraveling the mystery that had consumed the household. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that the most dangerous crimes were often those committed by people who believed themselves to be acting from noble motives, and that justice, while necessary, was rarely simple in its application to the complex realities of the human heart. The road away from Ashworth Manor stretched clear and inviting through the winter landscape, but Miss Marple knew that for those she left behind, the journey toward redemption would be far longer and more difficult than any physical path through the snow. The thaw had begun by the time Miss Marple's carriage pulled away from Ashworth Manor, the snow yielding to reveal patches of dark earth like secrets finally brought to light. Through the frost-etched windows, she watched the estate recede into the white landscape, its imposing facade now holding different shadows than when she had first arrived for what was meant to be a simple 12th night celebration. The official proceedings had concluded with surprising swiftness once the truth emerged. Dr. Morrison faced charges of manslaughter rather than murder, the circumstances of provocation and his previously unblemished reputation weighing heavily in his favor. His confession had come with visible relief, as if the burden of deception had proven heavier than the prospect of justice. Miss Prynn, charged as accessory after the fact, had been released on Sir Henry's recognizance, her fierce devotion to Clara earning grudging respect even from Constable Meadows, who had initially been so eager to accept the convenient verdict of accidental death. Clara's future, once shadowed by the threat of social ruin, now promised genuine hope. Sir Henry's decision to honor her position in the household had been formalized in documents that could not be altered by future whims. More significantly, he had agreed to receive Lieutenant Rawlins formally upon his return from military service, acknowledging the secret marriage that Oliver had used as leverage for his cruel manipulations. The young woman's relief had been profound, though tempered by genuine sorrow for the violence that had purchased her freedom. Miss Marple reflected on the intricate web of relationships that had made this tragedy inevitable. Oliver Ashworth had been both victim and victimizer, a young man whose financial desperation had led him to prey upon the vulnerabilities of those around him with calculated cruelty. His systematic collection of compromising information, Dr. Morrison and Miss Prynn's hidden parentage of Clara, her secret marriage, even Miss Prynn's own past captured in that damning photograph, had created a powder keg of desperation that ultimately exploded in fatal violence. The technical aspects of the crime revealed themselves to be less sophisticated than initially appeared, yet no less carefully planned. Miss Prynn's use of the old string and wax technique to manipulate Oliver's door lock had been methodical, her left-handedness leaving telltale traces from the hearth brush to the lavender-scented wax from her personal seal. The staging of the accident had required patience rather than particular skill, but it had also demanded the steady nerves of someone acting from desperate maternal love. Yet the true complexity lay not in the physical evidence, but in the emotional architecture of the crime. Dr. Morrison's paternal rage had been triggered by Oliver's gleeful description of how he would enjoy watching Clara's social destruction. Miss Prynn's subsequent actions, while legally culpable, stemmed from the same protective instinct that had driven her to conceal her daughter's true parentage for years. Both had acted from love, however misguided, creating a tragedy where sympathetic criminals had destroyed a genuinely malicious victim. The village would soon buzz with speculation, Mrs. Kellett undoubtedly refining her theories with dramatic embellishments. The rector would find in the tragedy a sermon on hidden sins, while the household staff would whisper of the strange justice that had befallen their young master. But Miss Marple understood that truth was always more nuanced than gossip or moral pronouncements could convey. As the familiar landscape of St. Mary Mead appeared through the carriage window, Miss Marple felt the gentle reassurance of returning home. She retrieved her knitting from her traveling bag, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. The lavender sprig pattern had come right at last, the earlier mistakes now corrected through patient attention to each stitch. The train that would complete her journey home arrived punctually, its whistle cutting through the winter air like a promise of return to ordinary concerns. Settling into her compartment, Miss Marple considered how this case had exemplified the fundamental truth that had guided her through so many investigations, that evil rarely announced itself with theatrical gestures, but more often wore the mask of desperate love or wounded pride. The snow continued to blanket the Gloucestershire countryside in pristine whiteness, covering the estate and its secrets beneath nature's forgiving hand. Yet Miss Marple knew that some stains could not be so easily erased, and that the consequences of human actions, once set in motion, continued to ripple through lives and relationships long after the immediate crisis had passed. As the train pulled away from the station and began its journey through the winter landscape, Miss Marple reflected that human nature, in all its complexity, remained her most reliable guide to truth. The pattern of love and betrayal, protection and destruction would repeat itself in countless variations, but so long as there were gardens to tend and patterns to observe, there would be someone to notice when a thread had been pulled and a whole design imperceptibly altered. In the blue room at Ashworth Manor, a young woman would wake to find that love, when freely given rather than bargained for, could indeed prove kind.